technologies in atypical ways. And just from hearing the sound check, I think that we're in for a huge treat. So please welcome Lee.
So thanks everyone for being here. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Hope you got your celebrations in. I want to thank again Molly for organizing this series, as well as ESS for hosting. As Molly mentioned, this is the last talk of this series, so it is a privilege to close it out. It's been fantastic learning from Ugo, Hunter, and Julie about the unique ways in which each of them uses machine learning in their own practices. For my talk today, I am going to talk a little bit about how I use machine learning, but I also want to take a bit of a step back and get a little philosophical here to tie things together. Because as we all know, machine learning algorithms have become increasingly powerful, increasingly prevalent over the past couple of years, right? And this is really a very recent development over the past decade. It's the kind of thing where on the one hand you see some incredible achievements technologically, on the other hand I think people are having rightful discussions about the role of these algorithms in our day-to-day lives, whether it's going to displace each of our jobs. And these algorithms are constructed and developed for functional purposes, right? They're developed by big tech companies, by academic research labs to do very particular useful things. But I think most of us in this room are either artists to some degree or interested in the arts, and making art isn't about being correct, right? Making art is about being provocative, being evocative, creating beautiful sensory experiences for people, however you want to define it. So I really want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about what does making art with AI really mean today, and how can it be something that is interesting, critical, provocative from each of our particular viewpoints rather than a purely functional technological tool. So a little bit about myself. As Molly mentioned, I am a multimedia artist. I primarily do installation and performance work using video, sound, text, and a lot of custom software. So this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the things I've done over the past couple of years. My performance work, which I'll share some more of later today, is primarily as post-consumer material in collaboration with sound artist Eslen Usher here, so he will also be helping me out with the performance later. In terms of my scientific and engineering background, I've honestly trained so many models that I've kind of lost count in a variety of contexts, ranging from in research labs trying to publish papers, to fine art studios creating art pieces, to in tech companies building products that millions of people are using every day. And so in some ways I would say, in kind of the discussion of are you an AI optimist or are you an AI pessimist, I'm an AI realist. I would say I don't necessarily think machine learning models are always interesting in and of themselves. I think we're kind of in this hype cycle where people view these technologies as almost a hammer and everything is a nail, right? But not everything warrants this technology. Not every application of this technology is good or useful or interesting. And it's honestly kind of incredible thinking about even just the progression of these technologies over the past decade, where when I first started working in this space, they're mostly, I would say, science fair experiments. If you could get a model to generate something that was 50 pixels wide by 50 pixels tall and vaguely resembled something that kind of looks plausible, that was incredible, right? And now with the advance of hardware, with the amount of capital being poured into these technologies, obviously we are much further along. We have very compelling deep fakes. We have all these tools that are becoming increasingly ubiquitous and embedded within our day-to-day lives. And so a lot of what I want to talk about today is not only how can we use machine learning, but how can we think about machine learning and interrogate it in an artistic context. So taking a step back, I do want to touch upon the terminology here a little bit, because we talk about AI these days, right? And artificial intelligence is a term that predates the existence of today's technology. So there's kind of this common adage going back decades that AI is whatever hasn't been done yet. When you think about HAL from 2001: Space Odyssey, or any depiction of AI in media, there's this notion of it's all knowing, it's all powerful, it can do anything, it's this really scary thing. But at the same time, the lines around what actually constitutes AI is pretty blurry. And historically, when people think about AI, I think really what they're talking about is a notion called artificial general intelligence. So artificial general intelligence is AI that can reason for itself, that can take action on its own behalf. It's the kind of thing that's, a little bit spooky and often depicted in science fiction novels and films. And for the longest time, we weren't really there yet. But at the same time, as you've seen in, DALL-E, Midjourney, ChatGPT, and all of the really most recent variants, there's increasingly large institutions who are trying to make the claim that models like GPT-4, which is the model behind ChatGPT, maybe you can make the argument that these are viewable as an early version of an artificial general intelligence system. So if you think about things like the Turing test, which is if an AI is good enough to convince someone talking to it that there's a person on the other end of the line, to be honest, we're already there yet. But just because we've passed that bar doesn't mean that the AI is all-knowing, is all-powerful, right? So there's kind of this question of what really is it? How powerful is it? Does it really matter if perceptually we feel like it has this intelligence? Maybe, maybe not. But to be precise, the kinds of technologies that we'll be talking about in these slides and that all of the preceding speakers have been talking about are really what's called deep neural networks. So I'm going to get a little bit technical here and walk through kind of both the ecosystem around deep neural networks as well as kind of how they work. And this is not to be, overly pedantic, but to give you guys a sense of how they function so that we can think about their outputs in a more interesting and a more critical way. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that AI is booming in general outside of art, and there's a vast ecosystem of people who are developing these kinds of technologies for various incentives that often have nothing to do with aesthetics or art making, right? So like most of the technologies that you'll see, even the technologies that artists are using, are coming out of academia, they're coming out of big tech, they're coming out of startups, and they're coming out of some grassroots collectives like Eleuther AI, for example, which is a group of researchers who've been trying to produce their own open source version of ChatGPT and similar large language models. The thing to keep in mind, is that these entities are not really interested in making art or making things that are beautiful, right? They're interested in publishing papers, they're interested in establishing market leadership. And coming out of these actors, we now have tons and tons of models every single day. So this is a snapshot from a website called paperswithcode.com. If you want to literally do anything with machine learning or anything with an AI model, I would encourage you to go on this website and you can literally find tens, thousands, up here it's 120,000 papers that all have their own machine learning models, their own machine learning implementations for pretty much every single task you can imagine. And one thing to keep in mind in engaging with this space critically is that every one of these papers is going to be claiming they're doing something so spectacular, they're doing something way better than anyone has ever done it before. And that might be true, but each of these papers is going to be cherry picking particular examples, right? They're going to be proving that maybe they're 1% better on some limited benchmark. But the point is that this field is really evolving all the time. I'm sure since I took this screenshot, there's 1,000 more papers that have come out or something along those lines. So if we think about then, what is machine learning being used for across society? It's because it's not just generative tools for art or music making, right? Every single one of us is interacting with machine learning algorithms, whether we know it or not. And some of these instances might be well publicized. Some of these instances might be intentionally obfuscated from us. But their presence in our day-to-day lives is inescapable, and whether some of these use cases are good or not good is also questionable. So it's important to situate this technology within a broader societal context because artists are, at the end of the day, consumers of these technologies, and art is one potential use case of it. Art is a good use case of it, potentially, but that is not the only application of these technologies, and so that has implications in how we situate them. This has implications for how we engage with them. So these technologies, like I mentioned, are used everywhere all the time, and despite immense resources being poured into making these systems good, making these systems profitable, they are not perfect. And so this is a screenshot of a variety of press reports from various instances in which state-of-the-art technologies that hundreds of the brightest minds with billions of dollars behind them have developed that have yet still failed to catastrophic consequences. In South Korea, a factory worker was crushed to death because a computer vision algorithm in a piece of manufacturing equipment mistook him for a box. Incredibly tragic. Cruise, which is a provider of driverless cars, was running a lot of experiments in California and had to stop all of their operations in the US because they dragged a pedestrian for 20 feet after a collision, again, because the computer vision algorithms and the other algorithms within these cars failed. We've all heard about Microsoft's AI chatbot that was deployed a couple of years ago called Tay, which was originally sent out to be kind of this fun thing that you could interact with and teach, and Twitter taught it to be racist in less than a day. And even with all of the resources at Google, they still to this day cannot develop an algorithm that predicts what's in a picture without being racist. And so they're just like sidestepping this, right? And so the point is that even though this technology has a lot of potential, even though it can be very exciting, it is really not as good as we might think. And it's important to keep that in mind. So why is that? And again, this slide is maybe a little bit technical, but I think the key thing to keep in mind is that this is how every single machine learning algorithm is trained. What's inside each of these boxes can be incredibly complicated and is going to differ from each problem space, each domain. But fundamentally, the model is a lot of matrices learning what numbers they should contain and what operations they should perform in order to produce outputs that look like a set of training examples. Whether this is an image generator, whether this is a text classifier, it's all the same thing, and it's basically entirely constrained and predicated by what kind of information you're providing it, what kind of information you're teaching it to copy, teaching it to produce. So, in our very tragic factory worker example, you have an image classifier. It's looking at inputs like that and it's trying to determine if this person is a box or not. And sadly, in this case, the model predicted that this person was a box, and this has disastrous consequences. And the thing to keep in mind is that every single model will fail because you essentially never get a training loss that's zero, right? Like you never have a model that's perfect. And something to keep in mind too is that like in training these models, it's trying to minimize the number of times it mispredicts, sure, but that's always going to be a mathematical function, right? So the way that you think about what does it mean when the model fails, that can have human consequences in the real world that dramatically exceed any distillation that we can represent in a numerical sense. And this is true for every single model. So in a generative context then, whether we're thinking about an image generator or a model that produces songs, a model that produces poems, whatever you want, it's important to remember that these models are completely constrained by the provided examples. So you show it every single image that's been scraped from the internet, like a lot of Dolly, Midjourney, etc. have been trained on. And what it's going to give you is something that looks like every single image that's been scraped from the internet, right? It might not all look the same, obviously, but it's going to mimic what it knows. It's going to mimic what it sees. And I think this has interesting implications for a lot of us here as artists, because these models, even when it's really interesting, even when it's kind of finding these sort of liminal middle grounds between the examples that it's seen, at the end of the day, it's kind of fundamentally derivative, right? And I don't think any artist in here is going to say, I aspire to create derivative works. At the same time, these models can, do a lot of things that humans can't, so it's interesting from a tooling-based perspective, but from a end-to-end sense, it's not going to give you something that doesn't exist. It's not going to give you something that doesn't exist in the world in some way already, even if it's combinations of existing entities. So on that note, I want to break down a couple of ways to think about machine learning in the context of art making. And you can kind of think about it as both a tool as well as a subject. And I'll get more into this on the subsequent slides. But machine learning as tooling, broadly speaking, you can think about it as integrating these algorithms in your own creative processes in some way, right? Whether it's kind of replacing tasks the artist would perform, or extending things on behalf of the artist, executing specific techniques you don't otherwise have access to, or distilling a large corpus of data that you cannot manually sift through yourself because it's like billions of images or whatever. I think the question to ask here is, does it really matter that it's AI in this case? Because you as the artist make tons of decisions, use tons of techniques in everything that you do, right? And I think you would say that the value of what you ultimately create is the sum of your creative decisions. It's the sum of your creative judgments. So AI can enable certain decisions, but AI is not going to make an artwork good in and of itself, right? You have to choose to use the AI in some sort of way that contributes to your ultimate creative vision, whatever that is, and that's something that you as a human determine. Machine learning as a subject is also kind of interesting because just as we make art about love, about the ecosystems we live in, about war, about economies, machine learning is also a valid topic in that it has become so pervasive, it has become so ubiquitous, it affects and touches our lives no matter what, right? And you can write essays about that, or you can kind of turn machine learning tools on themselves. And so one thing to think about on this side is, can you get machine learning algorithms to reveal their own failure modes? And what does that say then about how similar technologies are deployed more broadly? What kind of autonomous outcomes do machine learning algorithms arrive at on their own? And again, what does this imply? Last thing here, latent ontologies, is a reflection of the fact that these models have been trained on basically as much data as they can grab or steal or scrape from the internet, right? And in some ways, there's arguably, just as there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, there's no ethical machine learning under the quest for AGI. These models are only good because they've taken vast amounts of data about the world and ingested them in order to teach itself basically everything it can possibly learn, right? But then what it is learning is what we've collectively put out into the world. So if a model is trained to be racist, it might be because we as a society have put out data that models those value systems, and these algorithms are then latching on that. And so in this mode, I think this is also very interesting, but in this sense, it's like, does it even really matter if the AI is good in these instances, right? Because even if the AI isn't perfect, even if it fails, it might still reveal something interesting and unintended that the developers of the algorithm didn't necessarily set out to achieve. So I think the ultimate question I would sort of ask here and frame this entire discussion around is the art itself actually interesting regardless of how it's using AI, right? And I think arguably scientific innovation is very exciting, but scientific innovation by itself is not necessarily art. And there's an incredible element of agency here that we as artists have and is incredibly important. So going one by one through each of these categories, the first category is the kind of thing that I think most people have heard about, a lot of us are familiar with, which is purely generative tooling. So this is things like DALL-E, which takes text and produces images. Midjourney is very similar. Sora is a recent development from OpenAI that will create videos from text. And then you have Lyria on the top right corner, which is generating music samples. And of course, ChatGPT. I think most people here are familiar with that. And it's important to keep in mind too that even though these examples of here are incredibly impressive, they look really cool. Again, every single one of these products is cherry picking their examples. Every one of these products is going to produce outputs that are nonsensical, that leave something to be desired, that have telltales that the output is AI generated rather than human generated or real. And so there's still tons of quality improvements that remain, right? There's things like duration and size. These music generators can generate songs that are, up to a certain duration, for example. But if you want to keep going, if you want to get to an hour-long film, for example, Sora can't do that, right? Sora can only produce 1 or 2 minute clips of video. There's, of course, spatial and temporal consistency. So if you see a lot of models that have text that's nonsensical, or models that depict things that aren't anchored in the reality of the world, like for example, a human hand that has 6 fingers in the wrong places, those are all examples of how these models are still not entirely grounded in truth. And again, every output generated by these models is, of course, definitionally derivative because it's reflecting something about its training data. So that is presumably not your goal as an artist. The last thing I'll say here is that, I think these tools are interesting and potentially useful for things like creating samples or proofs of concepts or components that you then integrate into some larger work. But the input and output data granularity is very imbalanced, right? So like you can type in, a sentence or two and you get a video out. But in practice, whether you are a musician or whether you are a filmmaker or whether you are a painter, every single decision you make when you're making your artwork matters, right? So every single note in a song, every single effect you apply, every brushstroke, those are all deliberate decisions that you make. And these models are nowhere near the point at which they can mirror that granularity of thought and intention, detail by detail, bit by bit, right? Maybe there's some point in the future, like decades from now, where that is possible, where you sync your brain with one of these, and maybe then their use case is very different. But for now, I would say, even as scary as these can feel, their applicability, their usability, certainly their originality still leaves a lot to be desired. Another category of machine learning as tooling is extending on behalf of artists. So one way to think about this, kind of the canonical example, is artists taking some existing neural network architecture and then training it or fine-tuning it on their original content. So on the left here, this is Holly Plus from Holly Herndon, where she took many recordings of her own voice and trained a neural network to be able to sing and speak in her voice. On the right is some experiments by the painter David Tsao, where he took an image generator model and then fine-tuned it based on feedback from human evaluators to say, these outputs are more similar to my existing body of work. And so the model learns over time to generate outputs that resemble existing paintings in his corpus. So this is kind of interesting from a utilitarian perspective, right? In that you as a musician, for example, you don't have the time as a human to collaborate with 10,000 people to sing on 10,000 tracks at the same time. But you can train a model to behave very similarly as you, and then all of a sudden lots of people can collaborate with you. This is very interesting, but I think it still then behooves the final user of these technologies to do something interesting with this resource, right? It's like having an incredible set of samples to work with, but you still have to compose a song from those samples. I think there's also an interesting question here about whether these outputs are more interesting than something that these artists would have already created, in that they're meant to resemble the artist's original output. So that's an interesting question, but regardless, there's some sort of utility here at least. There's also, of course, using machine learning models to execute specific techniques that humans may not otherwise have access to or would be incredibly time intensive to implement. So a couple of examples here are Ugo demonstrated VampNet a couple of weeks ago, and this lets you do things like produce a bit of typewriter sounds that match your human speech. This would be very difficult to do kind of manually, right? There's style transfer models that you can download tons of apps on your phone for this. You can generate some photo that you took in the style of some artists. There's things like super resolution, which can take a very small blurry image and make it a lot bigger, a lot more high fidelity. And then there's techniques like in-painting or video interpolation, where you can take an image or a video that has gaps in it and fill in those gaps in some ways. And there's a ton more out there. If you go on Papers with Code, you can find a model that basically does anything and more. So these are all very interesting, but again, it's up to you as the human to use these techniques to do something interesting with it. Finally, the last thing I'll touch upon here is the notion of distilling data. And this is a work that premiered at MoMA pretty recently, where this artist took essentially every image in the collection of MoMA and trained an image generator to produce other images that resembled MoMA's existing collection. I've included a quote here from a reviewer in eFlux who describes this work as An exercise in post-industrial American triumphalism, surveillance technology, and repressive deep state R&D disguised as visually appealing, non-referential images. So I would recommend reading this article whether you agree with it or not, because I think it makes a valid point in that you cannot divorce the artifacts coming out of these technologies from their fundamental origins, right? And you might choose to look at this work and think, I don't care how it's produced, I think MoMA's collection is beautiful, and I think this piece encapsulates everything I love about 20th century art. Or you might look at something like this and say, well, what is the point? This is like a blurry simulation of these images. This is something that carries a kind of already trite kind of generative adversarial network aesthetic, and I want the real thing. So you can make your own decision about whether you like something like this or not, but I think this is an interesting kind of case in point of where you fall on the spectrum and what are some of the questions that one might ask about art making with these technologies beyond, is it cool or not? Moving on to machine learning as a subject, I've kind of articulated here, a couple of interesting questions to chew on. So the first thing is that models themselves are fascinating artifacts, right? They contain a lot of information and they do behave sometimes in unanticipated ways. So in some ways, is DALL-E itself, is the model that can generate any kind of image from text inputs, is that the interactive artwork more so than the prompted outputs that someone gets from poking it with, a lot of different text descriptions? What do the uncanny aesthetics of model-produced outputs evoke? I think there's, a sense right now that for a lot of people, when you see a model-generated output, even if it looks weird, even if it doesn't look correct, it's interesting, right? But is it interesting because you're seeing it for the first time? Or is it interesting for reasons beyond that? And I think in some ways we're already kind of getting beyond the point where, the first Google Deep Dream outputs or the first StyleGAN outputs, everybody's like, whoa, what is this? But I think a lot of us have become maybe a little bit tired of all the AI art flying around, right? Like a lot of social media networks or, subreddits have started banning AI art because they do have telltale signatures. And for some people, it's kind of getting tired already. So maybe the aesthetics of model-produced outputs can be interesting, but are they interesting for reasons beyond the fact that they're new and unfamiliar? We've talked about how models are deployed in innumerable scenarios, both scenarios that are loudly advertised as well as intentionally obfuscated. So your phone doesn't really want you to know that it's tracking all of your interactions on Instagram or TikTok and feeding you things accordingly, right? But it's incredibly valuable to these social media networks to be doing things like this. So given that these algorithms are so complex and in some ways a little untouchable through alternative means, how can we use art as a way to interrogate this reality? How can we turn these technologies on themselves? And then the last thing he already mentioned, but what do the values and beliefs these models learn suggest about our collective values and beliefs as a society? I think these models, as the title of the talk suggests, acts as a bit of an undiscerning mirror, right? Where they don't necessarily have their own value systems. They don't have their own judgment and discernment. They are parroting back what we've shown it. And in some ways that then offers a more blunt critique than might otherwise be achievable, where if a model says something incredibly heinous, it's not choosing to do that, it's just doing that because we've taught it something about how that output gets a response, it gets validated. And so this can be a way of kind of turning a mirror on us collectively as a society, on our collective outputs. What do we value when we're not even intending to directly show it, right? Like, what does this say about us when we're not trying to explicitly articulate our position? So I'm going to start talking about now a couple of pieces that are machine learning adjacent, and they're going to be machine learning adjacent in different ways. The first one that I'm starting with is kind of a viral piece a lot of you have probably seen on the internet called Can't Help Myself by Sun Yuan and Peng Yu. And I include this because this is from 2016. And so in this piece, there's a kind of robot that resembles, factory machinery, and it's going through a series of, something like 20 or 30 motions that it's learned, and it's interacting with kind of this pool of liquid that obviously it looks like blood. So there's something kind of macabre about it, right? There's something here that's probably touching on the notion of the rote mechanisms of industrial labor and kind of its banality, its senselessness, even in the face of things that to humans may appear as immediately horrific. I include this because, as you see in the medium list on the right, it doesn't say anything about using machine learning, right? And at this point in time, it might not have. But if you look up the Cognex visual recognition sensor that it does use, which is a commonly used device in industrial equipment, you see now that in the year 2024, they do offer a model that does use AI. And of course, why wouldn't it? It exists to perform a task, and computer vision models are better at that task than whatever they've done before. So I call this out as one place to think about AI can facilitate a task potentially, but whether the ultimate artwork uses AI or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that that particular task is achieved in some way that's grounded in the reality of how, industrial systems operate at that particular point in time, right? The next piece I want to touch on is The City of Broken Windows by the German artist Hito Steyrl. So this is a video installation that includes sound as well. I'll play this video clip in a minute, but essentially what she did here is she filmed a documentary of a home security startup. So this home security startup is basically training a model to recognize the sound of broken glass, so that homeowners or factory owners or whoever, you hear broken glass, oh no, my property is getting broken into. And at the same time, it's accompanied by a sound work that includes glass breaking sounds synthesized by AI models. So this is kind of interesting in that it's kind of about the ways in which AI is deployed and embedded, and almost kind of this strange and even a little bit silly ways that these models are developed and trained. And what does that mean about the mechanisms through which we then engage with the world around us?
We're going to use very sophisticated computer algorithms to actually have the computers somehow model or learn the sound of windows breaking, and then we can put that in the device of our customers. Everything you can imagine in the smart home, and you have a whole lot of applications in the smart home that you could imagine for this technology. There is a French zoologist called Buffon who established a sort of inventory of animals on the planet. And so, while some animals have 4 feet, some of them have 2 only, and so on. And we're kind of doing the same with sounds. Sounds, there's a really huge variety of sounds. Some of them are percussive, so breaking a window is a bang followed by some kind of smashes and so on. Windows are a lot harder than we think. The first time I tried to break a window, I was like, bonk, it's not breaking. So you have to hit very, very hard. But now what we're doing here is really actual window breaking. We're actually taking a hammer and actually breaking a window. So this is reality.
So yeah, there's something interesting here too about kind of placing the sensory inputs of the world, which are incredibly complex, incredibly granular, into a particular kind of taxonomy, and saying this is what a breaking windows sounds like, but you can kind of extrapolate that to a lot of different things, and whether or not that really makes sense, it's an interesting question. The next piece here is a project by the research agency Forensic Architecture called Triple Chaser. So Forensic Architecture describes their mandate as to develop, employ, and disseminate new techniques, methods, and concepts for investigating state and corporate violence. And in this particular project, it was kind of interesting because it originated out of their invitation to the Whitney Biennial, and as a matter of fact, one of the members of their board of trustees, Warren B. Canders, owns a company called Safariland that produces tear gas canisters. And this particular tear gas canister is called Triple Chaser, hence the name. So what's interesting is that there are certain kinds of munition sales that are publicly tracked. Tear gas canisters are apparently not. So this group developed a computer vision algorithm that essentially looks at images and detects the presence of Triple Chaser tear gas canisters from Safariland. And in doing so, they were actually able to determine various instances in which these tear gas canisters were deployed, and kind of trace the usage of these weapons around the world. And so this is kind of interesting because, like, on the one hand, it's a very straightforward machine learning project. The way that they trained these models was, following best practices. They used synthesized training data to augment their training processes. It's done very well, but the use case for these machine learning algorithms is very different from how they might be typically used in an industrial context, right? The last thing here is Trevor Paglen's. They took the faces from the accused and the dead, ... So Trevor Paglen, of course, has a background as kind of a investigative photographer, right? He takes pictures of military black sites and prison complexes and so on in order to reveal the physical sites, material infrastructures underpinning the networks of power that monitor and control society. So this is an artwork that takes photos of individuals who were both convicted as well as merely accused of crimes in, I think it was like the 60s, or clearly something that going really far back. And what's interesting is that, as we've talked about, these models are entirely constrained and limited by the data that they've been fed, right? So if you go back to the origins of machine learning, if you're trying to train a model to do something, your first step is going to be finding data that is labeled, that is well structured, that you can use to train your models. So in this case, this database of prisoners was something that was used to train the first generation facial recognition algorithms. And this particular work both displays the images from this data set as well as organizes them in some structure of kind of similarity and kind of like feature taxonomies and so on, reflecting the way that the ultimate models are behaving and interpreting images. So this is kind of an interesting way of thinking about like the fundamental objects that contribute to these machine learning algorithms, and how rather than being, an abstraction, they're actually anchored in some really problematic and terrible things from history going back many decades before the emergence of these technologies today. I'm going to change tacks a little bit and talk about two works that I will be presenting shortly and the machine learning techniques underlying them. And in some ways, I'll say like the machine learning techniques here used are not necessarily that special. They're definitely not state of the art at this point because I did all of this like a year and a half ago. So whatever I used, I'm sure you can go online and you'll find a model that does the same thing but better. But this might be interesting as a way of both showing how I work with machine learning as well as kind of some of the things that you might consider in incorporating some of these techniques in your own practices. So Instruction is a video piece that basically takes a lot of non-existent self-help influencers based on YouTube videos and kind of voices a lot of these sort of flat platitudes that reflect what we as a society seem to be responding to, seem to be searching on YouTube. So to create this work, I started with a very large data set called How to 100 Million, which is essentially a taxonomy of over 100 million YouTube videos and human-created labels for what kind of tasks they are instructing you to do. So these videos by themselves look like this, right? This is a frame from a YouTube self-help video from some woman telling people, how do you love your busy life? You know, how do you live as a woman, as a mother, so on. From there, I ran it through a face detection neural network in order to filter down all of the videos within the thematic categories I wanted to work in to just frames with one person facing kind of head on. From there, all of the matching videos were then ran first through an anonymization convolutional neural network, as well as a super resolution network that then makes the images both higher resolution, as well as improves the fidelity of the faces in these models in particular. As a parallel path, I also remove the backgrounds of these frames, so you can run this through, you know, a very straightforward background segmentation network to get masks that you can then use to composite these two sets of inputs. So you get some images that are high resolution that don't have a background, and then there's a lot of iterating, a lot of back and forth to both collate it all together and as well as choosing the right hyperparameters, which kind of feels like that little emoji up there. But the ultimate output looks something like this. So this is the same from the same video as, you know, the one that we saw in the previous frame, but it's not a real person, it's a fake person. It's just somebody voicing the same sentiments that were in the original video. And we'll see more of this shortly. The second piece that I'm presenting today is a sound piece called Ecstasies. It's kind of touching upon a lot of the same themes. It uses a lot of machine voice text to go through ideas of self-optimization, self-improvement, and to what extent that makes sense in, you know, a very human, a very messy world. And so for this, I used a variety of text-to-speech algorithms, including ones that weren't necessarily the best ones, right? So for example, here, you know, I took GPT-2, which is a language model. It can produce bits of text. And I also took news articles from The Guardian, the news website, specifically focusing on articles that talk about themes of optimism, of hope, of aspiration, of self-improvement. To be clear, GPT-2 is not the best model out there, right? Like, we're at GPT-4 now, GPT-5 is coming out soon. There's 1,000 competitors out there that are much better. But there is something that's kind of almost a little undesirable to me about the very best models, because they've been optimized for a very particular, a very kind of commercial task, right? So if you talk to ChatGPT, it has a very particular voice. It's very kind of friendly. Yes, I'm happy to help with that. And it's almost too smooth. But if you go to, you know, previous generations of models, they can be in some ways kind of bad. Like if you're trying to build a customer support chatbot, you don't want to use GPT-2, right? But it exposes some rough edges that are a little bit more interesting to me from an artistic perspective. So I fine-tuned GPT-2 on these news articles. This then gives you generated text from this fine-tuned model guided by your training data, which is these news articles that I was trying to emulate. And again, the use of news articles here is then intended to kind of reflect what we've collectively put out there, right? Like how we talk about these ideas, and then having the model kind of trying to imprecisely parrot that. From there, we run it through a text-to-speech algorithm. We go through a lot of different voices. This gives you audio samples that then you can incorporate in a composition. And so, you know, this is us having fun with all of the many samples that we get out of this process. This is actually not the output of the fine-tuning process. This is a slightly different thing that I did for this same work, which you'll see in a minute. This is a discussion between myself and a open source large language model. I believe this was GPT Neo J, which is kind of an open source equivalent of GPT-3. The idea here is that the text in black is for me, and the text in blue is the model attempting to complete what I've shown in. And so in some ways, you know, if you kind of like look through this, some of the things that it's saying are a little poetic, and that's interesting, and some of the things that it's saying are kind of fucked up, and that's also interesting. You know, like the fact that it went there in response to these inputs, it kind of creates this like uncanny dialogue, which is interesting. It's revelatory. It sort of speaks to kind of, again, what kind of values is it parroting from what it's seen. The last thing that I'll show here is, this is kind of where I'm going next in my practice. So everything that we'll be talking about today, the couple of previous slides, those are all from sort of the past like year or two, right? And going forward, I'm really interested in setting up these kind of autonomous systems that are a little dynamic, a lot of out of control, but in and of themselves contain some sort of distilled self-critique. So this is a concept image I've mocked up. This is not a real thing. But the idea here is that, you know, when we're scrolling through our phones, we get a lot of ads for disposable products, right? And it's easy to click on that ad and purchase that item from Temu, from Wish, from Shein, you know, choose your poison, and you get a little bit of dopamine hit from that, right? It distracts you, it provides you a little bit of pleasure, and you're not thinking about the destruction of the planet due to climate change and war and, you know, whatever other realities we live beside but choose to avert our gaze from. Simultaneously, neural networks have an incredible carbon footprint. You know, if you guys think about like mining Bitcoin is using a ton of electricity, and that's horrible. These neural networks are basically trained with the same resource consumption needs. And so the idea here is that this piece is an installation that will have kind of foreground channels that represent desirable content that are meant to lure you in, as well as background channels reflecting the environmental impact of our consumption patterns. And so the idea is that this will be set up in kind of a very autonomous way, where the idea is not that these outputs are necessarily pretty or nice, but it's kind of encoding existing logic about our world into two machine learning systems that then react to each other in real time. And, you know, I won't know what happens beyond that point, right? Like, these systems could converge into nonsense, they could fail, they could go completely awry in a way that I can't anticipate. But what do the behaviors of these systems then suggest about how these similar logical cycles are playing out in our real world that we all live in? So this is just a kind of a brief diagram of how it's all going to work. You know, this is still really fuzzy. I have to do a lot more research here, but essentially I'm imagining this as two synthesis networks, both for audio as well as for video. And the idea is that they're trained on certain seed media, so they know how to do certain things, but they also react to each other in real time according to reinforcement learning objectives anchored in what each channel is doing over the course of the installation. So hopefully more to come in like a year or so. Stay tuned. So this is the end of the talk. I think the conclusion I would urge is, you are in charge, right? Like, use whatever models you want for whatever you want. Your art can benefit from these technologies, but it is so much more than its constituent methods and technologies. And I think you should really feel empowered to engage with these technologies rigorously, critically, whether it's critiquing them, whether it's co-opting them, whatever you want. All right, so that's my talk. Happy to answer any questions.
We might have time for one or two questions, and then take a little break, and then come back for performance.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little, I mean, the last slide is really about what my question is.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about your approach to prototyping, to sort of deciding like, oh, I should not do it this way? Like, could you talk a little bit about how you figure out what tools are usable enough to continue to make an artwork out of?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think the short answer is try a lot of things and establish their viability fast. I think, you know, one thing is that these models are incredibly expensive, right? So like training your own model, you know, can be something that seems fun in theory, but then you're like, oh, I don't have enough data, or it's going to take me like 2 months and like thousands of dollars just to get something remotely usable. So my starting point is always taking what it is I want to do and decomposing it into its constituent technical components. And then for each of those, it's kind of a discrete problem, right? It's like, You have a video, how do you get the frames in between the existing frames of your video? Or you have a picture of a person, how do you turn it into a picture of a person who doesn't exist? Decomposing the ultimate artwork into, it ends up being, you know, tens if not hundreds of small technical problems. But then for each of those technical problems, you can then say, what exists out there that I can leverage? If I test, you know, 10 or 100 sample images on it, am I getting outputs that I actually want? Which is often not the same thing as the right outputs, right? It's not what the developers of these networks might consider good. It might be what you as the artist look at and you say, yes, this actually fits in with the ultimate effect I'm trying to achieve with my work. So long story short, it's a lot of iteration, a lot of failing, but sometimes a lot of pleasant surprises.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned at some point that you like older models like GPT-2 because their outputs are not so realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And I find like, you know, I feel very similarly about like audio models.
Yeah.
Because like, yeah, like the more realistic they get, the less interesting they become.
Mm-hmm.
The more it's like, oh, I could have just recorded this like in
Right.
my living room.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, do you see like a community of like, kind of like underground like older models sort of like flourishing like in artist
Uh-huh.
communities?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if there exists like something formally organized, right? But I feel like there must be a lot of people who feel the same way. And, you know, even if you think about like making music, right? Like you put a distortion pedal on something, it's because you want it to sound distorted, but then like for certain kind of commercial use cases, distortion is bad, right? And so I think similarly, like image models, sound models, text models, it's like that glitchiness that is kind of its own honesty and its own aesthetic. And I think a lot of artists out there are exploring that, whether they would explicitly say they're part of this underground community or not.
True.
Thank you so much, XA. Yeah, let's give it up. We're gonna take like 5-10 minutes, do a little setup change and come back for a performance. If you'd like the restroom, it is out around and in that front room where you came in. But yeah, come back in 5 to 10. We'll get started again. That was like awesome.
Thank you, thank you.
Man, there are Thank you for being here. We are going to get started again here with a performance by Ecstasies. We're going to turn off some lights real quick.
A new kind of optimism, and 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 we've got to look forward to. Because hope is a very powerful combination of working. It allows us to look forward to the future, even if it will mean hard times for humanity and great challenges for the world. And optimism is a powerful combination, and we've got to look forward to that. And optimism, and optimism, and optimism, and optimism, and we've got to try to make sure that we've got the best for all of humanity. And we've got to try to make sure that we've got the best for humanity. And we've got to try to make sure that we've got the best for us. And we've got to find ways to make sure that we've got the best for us. And to find ways to make sure that we've got the best for us. And we've got to find ways in which we can help give people the best of both worlds that we want in a kind of caring. I think that's what's so exciting about hope, and so many of us are seeking to do is harness that hopefulness. Because I think that hopefulness can be very empowering, because I think so many of us have a very pessimistic view of the future. And so hopefulness can be very reassuring, because hopefulness can be very reassuring to see people connecting with each other. And in the end, we're all hopeful, but in the end, we make our own fate. We don't make it any more certain that we're going to get through it. Because that's the end of the world. That's the end of the world. And I think that optimism is what's really going to make us hopeful. Because that is not the world we know it inhabits. That's the world that we are currently in. That is the world that we're going to inhabit for the rest of our lives. Because we are living in that world. And that is what that hopefulness really demands. That is what that hopefulness demands. That is what the hopefulness of the human spirit is going to be. And that is what I think is so incredibly hopeful about hopeful writing. Because it is, to a certain extent, contradiction terms to be a hopeful person. And we've got to try to make sure that we've got the best for humanity. And we've got to try to make sure that we've got the best for us. And we've got to find ways to make sure that we've got the best for us. And to find ways to make sure that we've got the best for us. And we've got to find ways in which we can help give people the best of both worlds that we want in a kind of caring. And I think that's what's so exciting about hope, and so many of us are seeking to do is harness that hopefulness. because I think that hopefulness can be very empowering, because I think so many of us have a very pessimistic view of the future. And so hopefulness can be very reassuring, because hopefulness can be very reassuring to see people connecting with each other. And in the end, we're all hopeful, but in the end, we make our own fate. We don't make it any more certain that we're going to get through it, because that's the end of the world. That's the end of the world. And I think that optimism is what's really going to make us hopeful, because that is not the world we know it inhabits. That's the world that we are currently in. That is the world that we're going to inhabit for the rest of our lives, because we are living in that world. And that is what that hopefulness really demands. That is what that hopefulness demands. That is what the hopefulness of the human spirit is going to be. And that is what I think is so incredibly hopeful about hopeful writing, because it is, to a certain extent, contradiction turns to be a hopeful person.
worried about letting someone take your life, then it's better to ask for help. If it's not safe, then it's likely that you're not performing your job. Getting to know your community will make you more progressive. Being cool with your way of thinking increases your chances of being able to trust people. Being outgoing makes your job easier and increase trust in your leadership ability. Seeing the right people or not having it will make you more likely to find career and job security. To be cool with your way of thinking, you need to be able to set your goals. Others will have to work with you, and it'll obviously take you longer, which means you'll have to figure out how to get there first. Do what you gotta do to get there, not just to save lives, but to save lives for generations to come. Don't be self-centered, learn to be less dependent on others, educate yourself instead. Do not be too greedy, do not expect people to tell you what to expect, but to help you figure things out. Do not offer people anything it doesn't understand, introduce them to the world. First, keep responsibility down. Second, feel good about your results. If you're popular, people will start making money for you. Third, act like an actor by giving a hero. People will be more likely to see you as a great role model. The most important piece of advice I've heard about this is, don't get too carried away with your certainties. They may well be wrong, but it's okay to shift how you think and act because you're getting from what you've been given. And I bet a lot of people like to give it their all, but they also prefer to do it without any expectations that others might have. This is the kind of advice I've said a lot lately, and it's a good thing nobody is continually saying it's okay to fail merely because you're desperate to be accepted. Trust and security don't just come through emotion and belief, though they can, but by relying on these features of life itself. And to be safe, be willing to fall in love. Trust and security requires so much dedication that you need to be able to know how to be that person for decades to come. We're sure that these aren't easily attained. There are times when you need to do what's right and get something you're not entitled to, but not all of them are. So trust and security really matter, and they're not about this lack of confidence, but they also matter in a way that raises the stakes. It doesn't take a genius to have an ability to trust your boss or your product or other company. It takes a genius to have an ability to trust isn't equal to trust and security. And as long as you're confident it's safe, you're safe.
future infinite and shimmering. An infinity that is not the infinity of an atom, a cell, or a molecule, but in fact of all bodies in all respects, infinitely big.
I believe in spectacle of progress, a future infinite and shimmering. An infinity that is not the infinity of an atom, a cell, or a molecule, but in fact all bodies in all respects infinitely big.
believe in the logic of my own longing. I believe in my ability to be a person. I believe in the power of my spirit to be the me of my dreams.
I believe in the logic of my I believe in the logic of my I believe in my ability to be a person. I believe in the power of my spirit to be the me of my dreams.
I believe in my ability to be the me of my dreams. I believe in my ability to be the me of my dreams.
For my actualization, the world was constructed. Within my mind, my spirit lives and shall continue to dwell, having no other obligation than to be me.
For myself and my actualization, the world was constructed. Within my mind, my spirit lives and shall continue
For myself and my actualization,
having
the
no
world was
other
constructed.
obligation.
Within my mind, my spirit
For myself, the world is constructed. Within my mind, and shall continue to dwell, having no other obligation than to be.
For my sake, the world churns. Silica from grit and sand into hallucinations of beauty and wonder and all that is possible, in accordance with my voice, my touch, my wish.
For my sake, the world churns. Silica from grit and sand into hallucination of beauty and wonder and all that is possible, in accordance with my verse.
For my sake, the world churns. Silica from grit and sand into hallucination of beauty and wonder and all that is possible.
Public is like a piece of glass, a jar that I must shatter and insert the shards into the world if I am to make it clear.
The public is like a piece of glass, a jar that I must shatter and insert the shards into the world defined to redefine.
Jar that I must shatter and insert the shards into the world defined.
All will be restored again in glory, to resume and replenish and resurrect, and this kingdom will have no end.
To replenish and resurrect, this kingdom will have no end.
I look forward to the life of the world to come. At last, pristine.
Thank you. This is not part of it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here for our final event of Chicago Creative Machines. Give it up once more for X.A. Lee. I was just saying to several people, like, that talk was really accessible, and also I'm going to be thinking about all this for like 3 weeks straight. This is fascinating. I want to thank ESS one final time. Huge shout out to Kate and Troy for engineering and for ESS for hosting. Thank you all for being here. This is not the end of Chicago Creative Machines. Stay tuned on our website. There's potentially going to be a couple of programs in the summer. We're going to be building out the website with resources pointing to artists who are doing creative work, machine learning models, resources for learning about this stuff. So stay tuned. We have an Instagram as well. We'll be posting stuff there. And just keep an eye out for future events from Chicago Creative Machines. Thank you so much for participating in these.